Understanding probability. This number line goes from 0 to 1. We can see that the decimal 0.5 or 0.50 is right in the center because it's right between 0 and 1. And on the top, you can see the varying degrees of certainty that an event will happen. If it's 0, there's no chance it's going to happen. If it's in the middle, right, around 0.5 or 1/2, then it's one thing is just as likely to happen as the other. And then if it's all the way close to 1 or it's 1, then the event is certain to happen. So we have the decimal approximations at the bottom, but we can also write these values in fraction form. So of course 0 stays 0 and 1 stays 1, but 1/2 would be the fraction equivalent of 0.5. So what that means is if you have an event that is between 1/2 and 1 in this area, it's likely. If you have an event that is between 0 and 1/2, it is unlikely. The closer it is to 0, so in other words, the smaller the fraction, the less likely it is to happen. The closer it is to 1, the more certain you are that it will happen. We can also represent these as percents. This would be a 0% chance of something happening. This would be a 50% chance of something happening, and 1 is equivalent to a 100% chance of that event taking place. Let's practice that by finding the probabilities of these different colors coming up on this spinner. So what's the probability of the spinner landing on red? Well, if we look at the spinner, it is broken up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 equally sized pieces. One of those pieces is red, so the probability it will land on red is 1 out of 8. Let's look at yellow. There are 2 yellow pieces out of a total of 8, so yellow would be 2 out of 8, or we could write that as 1/4. Blue is also 2 out of 8, right? Yellow and blue are the same, there's the same number of pieces for those 2 colors. And then green, there are 1, 2, 3 out of 8. So 3 out of 8. Now, none of these pieces are most certainly going to be the one that you land on, right? None of them have a probability that's greater than 1/2 of being chosen. But if we were to rank them, 3/8, right? There are more pieces on the spinner that are green than the other 2 colors, right? Or the other 3 colors, right? Then you would say maybe blue and yellow are equally as likely, and then red is the least likely outcome when you spin the spinner. I put all of these in fraction form, but we could have also put them in decimal or percent. I'm going to start with the 1/4 because 4 is a denominator that goes into 100. Remember, if the denominator goes into 10 or 100, then you can easily convert to decimal. So 1/4 is the same as 25 over 100, right? Because 4 goes into 100 25 times. So 1 times 25 is 25. And we know from our extensive work with percents that 25 hundredths is the same as, remember, hundredths is a synonym for percent. Hundredths and percent are synonyms. So 25 hundredths would be, I could go in 2 different directions, right? I could write it as a decimal. 25 hundredths is 0.25. Or I could write it as a percent, 25%, right? I could do the same thing with the blue because that's also 1/4. That would also be 0.25 or 25%. Now 1/8 and 3/8, 8 doesn't go into 10. It doesn't go into 100. It does go into 1,000, but that might actually be more work than just dividing. So for those two fractions, I'm going to do 1 divided by 8. 1 divided by 8 equals, and it comes out to be 0.125. As a percent, I would multiply by 100, right? Percent, 100, and I would get 12.5%. And then down here for the green section, same thing. I would do 3 divided by 8. 3 divided by 8 is 0.375, right? Which, as a percent, I would again multiply by 100, and I get 37.5%. All right, let's take a look at some of these fractions and decide if these probabilities are likely or unlikely. Remember, we have sort of like a continuum, right? It goes from 0 to 1. 0 being unlikely or not going to happen at all, no chance. 1 being it's definitely going to happen. So if a fraction is larger than 1/2, it's likely. If it's between 0 and 1/2, it is unlikely. Okay, so let's look at 2/47. 2/47, 2 and 47 are very far away from each other, right? So we know that 2 out of 47 is a very small fraction. So we can, with certainty, say that this is unlikely, right? Okay, 4/5. 4/5 I could write as a decimal or a fraction with a denominator of 10 if I wanted to, right? So if I wanted to, I could take 4/5 and I could write it as how many tenths? Think about that for a minute. 4/5. So 5 times 2 is 10. And then, right, 8, right? So we know that 8/10 is, we could go 2 different ways with this, right? 8/10 is 0.8, because that's the first place value is the tenths place. Or we could write it as 80/100ths, which is 80%, right? So 80% is closer to the 1. So we would say that this event is likely, right? How about 4/9? Now, if you remember, think back, dig into those memory banks. If you remember when we did 9ths, we get a repeated digit, right? So that means that we know that 4/9 is 0.4 repeating. Now 0.5 is a half, right? So 0.4 is a little bit smaller. So this would fall in the unlikely category. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it leans towards unlikely because it's less than a half. 10/13, when you're looking to see if something is larger or smaller than a half, it helps to know what half the denominator is. Half of 13, it's an odd number, right? So half of 12 is 6. So half of 13 is 6.5. So anything bigger than 6.5 on top is bigger than a half. Anything less than 6.5 in the numerator is unlikely, right? So this is likely. We can do the same thing with this one. 9ths, right? Half of 9 would be 4.5. 5 is larger, right? The top number is bigger than 4.5, so it's likely. 3 out of 100. Half of 100 is 50. This is much smaller than 50, right? So it is unlikely. All right, let's try a few more. 1/14. Half of 14 is 7. So anything smaller than that on top is unlikely. 7/8. Half of 8 is 4, right? So anything smaller than 4 on top would be unlikely. Anything bigger than 4, likely, right? Remember, you can also convert these to decimal if you prefer to do it that way. So I'll do it that way on the next one. I've got 6/14 for my next fraction, right? So 6/14 means the same thing as 6 divided by 14. When I do that on the calculator, let's see what I get. 6 divided by 14 is long because it's a 7th, right? So it repeats, but not for a while. So it's 0.4285. So I'm going to round that to 9. So I could write that as a percent. It would be about 42.9%, less than 50%. So unlikely. 1/15 is very small. I think that one's pretty clear right away. Unlikely. 6/7. 6 is very close to 7. When the numerator is very close to the denominator, that means that fraction's almost 1. So that's definitely likely. And then 5/12. Half of 12 is 6. And this is just a little bit smaller than that. So it would be unlikely, but let me show you how to do it this way. I would have 5 over 12. That means the same thing as 5 divided by 12. And then 5 divided by 12 is 0.4166666666. So I'm going to round to 7. Actually, I should make these both squigglies, right? Because I estimated there. So then this would be, now I'm not, now I'm just converting. This would be 41.7%. So almost 50%, but not quite. Still falls on the unlikely side of 1/2.